In this episode, we are focusing on how to approach CySA plus multiple choice questions in a way that helps beginners think more clearly instead of just hoping the right answer jumps out at them. A lot of learners assume multiple choice items are the easy part of an exam because they are not as interactive as performance-based questions, PBQs, but that can be misleading. These questions often feel simpler on the surface while quietly demanding careful reading, good judgment, and the ability to separate a strong answer from an answer that only sounds strong. The real challenge is not just knowing security terms. It is learning how the exam presents a small problem, gives you several plausible responses, and asks you to choose the one that best fits the situation. Once you understand that, multiple choice questions start feeling less like random tests of memory and more like short analyst decisions that happen to be presented in a controlled format. One of the most important things to understand about CySA plus multiple choice questions is that they are usually testing reasoning in context rather than isolated facts by themselves. Yes, there will be times when terminology matters, and yes, knowing definitions still helps, but the stronger questions tend to ask whether you can use what you know in a realistic way. That means the correct answer is often the one that matches the role, the timing, the environment, and the actual problem described in the question. Beginners sometimes get frustrated because more than one option can sound technically possible, and that feeling is real. The exam often includes one answer that might work somewhere, another that sounds impressive, and one that is actually the best fit for the situation presented. Your goal is not to find an answer that is merely true in general. Your goal is to find the answer that makes the most sense inside the exact scenario in front of you. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A very effective strategy is to pay close attention to what the question is actually asking before you spend much energy studying the answer choices. Many test takers look at the options too soon, and once they do that, their thinking becomes pulled in different directions by familiar words and technical phrases. A better habit is to read the question stem and figure out the job it wants done. Is it asking for the best first step, the most likely explanation, the highest priority weakness, the strongest indicator, or the most appropriate response? Those are very different tasks, and confusion begins when you treat them as though they are interchangeable. When you identify the task early, you give yourself a filter for judging the answers. Instead of asking which option sounds smartest, you ask which option does the specific job the question asked for. That small shift can dramatically improve accuracy because it keeps you anchored to the problem instead of drifting toward the flashiest language. Qualifying words deserve special respect on this exam because they often control the entire meaning of the question. Words like best, first, most likely, least effective, strongest, highest priority, and immediate are not decorative. They are the exam's way of narrowing the task and telling you how to compare the options. A beginner may read a scenario about a possible phishing attempt, see an answer about blocking malicious domains, and choose it because it sounds useful, while missing that the question actually asked for the first action an analyst should take. In that case, confirmation or validation may be the better fit before broader action occurs. This is why careful reading matters so much. The right answer is frequently not the biggest action or the most technical action. It is the action that matches the qualifier built into the question. When you start respecting those small words, many questions become easier because the field of reasonable answers narrows quickly. Elimination is one of the strongest multiple choice skills you can build because many questions become manageable before you know the exact right answer. Beginners often think they must instantly recognize the correct option in one perfect flash of understanding, but that is not how good test-taking usually works. Strong candidates often win by removing clearly weaker answers until the best remaining option becomes visible. One answer may happen too late in the process. Another may solve the wrong problem. Another may assume facts the scenario never gave you. Another may be technically true, but too broad to be the best answer in context. As you rule those out, the question stops looking like four equally intimidating possibilities and starts becoming a simpler comparison. Elimination also helps calm your thinking, because it gives you something concrete to do even when confidence is low. You move from feeling stuck to making progress, and that progress often leads you directly to the best answer. Another important strategy is learning to notice when the question is testing analyst judgment rather than raw technical knowledge. CySA Plus is not just a vocabulary test. It wants to know whether you can think like someone who monitors environments, investigates findings, prioritizes work, and communicates sensibly under realistic conditions. That means some questions are really asking whether you understand proportion and sequence. A severe response is not always the right first response. A technically clever action is not always the most appropriate next action. Sometimes the exam rewards the answer that preserves evidence, confirms the issue, reduces uncertainty, or supports coordination with the right team. That can be frustrating for beginners who expect the boldest answer to be the best answer. The better mindset is to think like a disciplined analyst instead of a dramatic rescuer. Analysts usually succeed by being accurate, timely, and purposeful rather than by choosing the most extreme response available. Distractors on multiple-choice exams are often built around partial truth, and recognizing that can save you from many avoidable mistakes. A distractor is rarely nonsense. It usually contains just enough truth to feel tempting. Maybe it names a real control, a real attack pattern, or a real response action, but it is misplaced in that specific scenario. For example, an answer may describe a valid long-term security improvement when the question actually asks for an immediate investigative step. Another may describe a useful containment action when the prompt is really asking you to identify the strongest indicator of compromise. The danger is that beginners often reward familiarity. If an option contains a term they studied recently, it feels safer than one that requires more careful thought. But multiple-choice success often depends on refusing to choose an answer merely because it contains something you recognize. The question is not asking whether the option is real. It is asking whether the option is best here. Scenario-based multiple-choice items become much easier when you learn to identify the clue pattern instead of reacting to each detail separately. CySA Plus questions often give you a short story involving a user, a system, a vulnerability finding, an alert, or a suspicious connection. If you treat every sentence like an isolated fact, the scenario feels cluttered and hard to interpret. A better approach is to ask what kind of pattern the details create when combined. Does the user behavior suggest account misuse? Does the endpoint behavior suggest malicious execution? Does the vulnerability belong to a critical exposed asset? Does the timing suggest that one event likely led to another? When you read with pattern recognition in mind, the scenario starts to feel coherent. That helps because the right answer usually responds to the overall pattern rather than to one random detail. In other words, the exam is often less interested in whether you noticed every fact than in whether you understood what the facts mean together. Time management also matters for multiple-choice questions, even though these items are often quicker than PBQs. Some learners make the mistake of treating every multiple-choice question as though it deserves the same amount of time, but that creates problems. Straightforward questions should move quickly so that harder scenario questions have room to breathe. If you linger too long on simple items because you want perfect certainty, you steal time from the questions that actually require more thought. The better approach is to move with purpose. Read carefully, choose with reasoning, and keep going when you have reached the point where extra time is not producing new insight. This does not mean rushing recklessly. It means recognizing diminishing returns. If you have narrowed the field and selected the best answer you can defend, continuing to stare at the same 4 options may only increase doubt rather than increase accuracy. Good pacing protects your mind from getting bogged down in places where momentum matters more than endless reconsideration. When uncertainty remains, there is still a smart way to guess. Guessing on CySA Plus should not mean random selection based on mood or pattern superstition. It should mean educated selection after reducing the field as much as possible. If 2 answers are obviously weak, remove them mentally and compare the remaining 2 against the exact wording of the question. Which one fits the qualifier better? Which one happens at the right stage of the process? Which one directly addresses the described risk or need? Which one assumes less that was not stated? Even when you are uncertain, this kind of structured comparison improves your odds and preserves your confidence. It also keeps you thinking like an analyst instead of like a gambler. That matters because uncertainty is normal on an analyst-oriented exam. The goal is not to feel perfect certainty all the time. The goal is to keep making the best available decision with the information in front of you. It also helps to know that CySA plus questions often reward understanding of sequence. Security work unfolds over time, and many multiple-choice items quietly test whether you grasp what should happen before something else. In an incident-related question, identifying or validating a problem may come before full containment. In a vulnerability question, prioritization may come before broad remediation. In a reporting question, confirming the scope and impact may come before sending a message to a wider audience. Beginners sometimes choose answers that are not wrong in a broad sense, but wrong in timing. That distinction matters a lot. The exam may give you an action that would eventually be reasonable, but not yet. If you keep sequence in mind, you can often eliminate answers that jump too far ahead or act as though earlier steps have already been completed. Thinking in stages is one of the simplest ways to make better choices on an exam built around defensive workflows. Another strategy is to watch for the difference between technical correctness and practical appropriateness. Cybersecurity is full of things that can be done, but exams like CySA plus often ask what should be done in a particular role and circumstance. That means the most technically aggressive action is not always the most appropriate one. A junior analyst may identify and escalate rather than make a sweeping infrastructure change. A team may need to preserve business continuity while addressing risk, which means a compensating control could be more realistic than an immediate disruptive fix. A report to management should emphasize impact and recommended action rather than drowning the audience in system-level detail. Multiple-choice questions often live in that space between possible and appropriate. The right answer is usually the one that respects role, timing, evidence, and business reality all at once. Once you understand that, the exam feels more like a professional judgment test and less like a contest to see who can choose the most intense option. Confidence on multiple-choice questions comes less from bravado and more from method. Many beginners think confident test takers are simply people who know everything, but that is rarely true. Confident candidates are often just candidates with a reliable process. They read the STEM carefully, notice qualifiers, identify the task, eliminate weak answers, compare the remaining choices against the scenario, and move on without carrying too much emotional baggage from one item to the next. That process works even when the question feels annoying. It works when the wording feels close. It works when you are unsure and need to narrow the field before choosing. Process matters because exams are mentally tiring, and good habits protect your judgment when energy drops. If you build that process now, the questions become less threatening because you always know what to do next, even when the answer is not immediately obvious. Review habits also matter because the way you practice multiple-choice questions shapes the way you perform on exam day. If you only check whether an answer was right or wrong, you miss much of the educational value. Better review means asking why the correct answer fit better, what clue mattered most, what wrong answer nearly fooled you, and whether your reasoning matched the logic of the item. Over time, you start noticing patterns. You realize that you repeatedly ignore qualifiers, or that you are too attracted to the most technical option, or that you confuse first response with final resolution. That kind of self-awareness improves future performance much more than simply doing higher volumes of questions. Multiple-choice strategy gets stronger when you study your own habits as carefully as you study the content. The exam is not just revealing what you know. It is revealing how you think under constraints, and that is something you can train deliberately. By the end of this discussion, the most important thing to remember is that CySA plus multiple-choice questions reward disciplined thinking far more than quick instinct alone. The strongest strategy is not a trick. It is a sequence of habits that keeps you close to the actual task being asked. Read the question before being seduced by the answers. Respect the qualifiers. Eliminate what does not fit. Think about sequence and context, and choose the option that best solves the specific problem presented. When you do that consistently, the exam starts feeling much less random. Instead of reacting emotionally to every technical phrase, you begin to approach each item like a developing analyst making one contained decision at a time. That is exactly the mindset this certification wants to see. And once that mindset becomes your default, multiple choice questions become far less intimidating and much more manageable.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.